The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the rose garden, her small fingers trailing along the perfectly trimmed hedges. At 9 years old, she carried herself with the poise expected of her position, but today something felt different. The familiar weight of royal protocol seemed heavier on her young shoulders, and the whispered conversations she had overheard between her parents the night before echoed in her mind. Guard Captain James Morrison stood at his post near the garden entrance, his trained eyes constantly scanning the perimeter while keeping a respectful distance from the young princess. He had served the royal family for 15 years, watching Charlotte grow from a toddling infant into the confident child she was today. Something about her demeanor this morning troubled him, though he couldn't quite place what it was. She moved more slowly than usual, pausing frequently to steady herself against garden benches and flower beds. The previous evening had been particularly tense within the palace walls. Charlotte had been playing quietly in the nursery when raised voices from her parents' private study caught her attention. Through the slightly open door, she had heard fragments of a heated discussion about family loyalties, about secrets that could damage the monarchy, and, most disturbing of all, whispered mentions of her step-grandmother Camilla's son from her first marriage. Tom Parker Bowles had always been a peripheral figure in Charlotte's young life, someone she knew existed but rarely encountered at family gatherings. He was Camilla's eldest son, a food critic and writer who generally stayed away from the spotlight of royal duties. But, lately, his name had been appearing in conversations that stopped abruptly when Charlotte entered the room, creating an atmosphere of tension that even a child could sense. As Charlotte continued her morning walk, she felt a strange dizziness beginning to cloud her thoughts. The pristine garden seemed to blur slightly around the edges, and she found herself gripping the stone railing of an ornamental bridge more tightly than necessary. Captain Morrison noticed the subtle change in her posture immediately, his protective instincts sharpening as he observed her from his position. The palace had been buzzing with unusual activity for weeks. Staff members spoke in hushed tones about investigations, about questions being asked regarding financial irregularities, and about how certain family members might be connected to scandals that could rock the very foundation of the monarchy. Charlotte had picked up on these undercurrents without fully understanding their implications, but the stress of the adult world around her was beginning to take its toll on her young system. Her governess, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, had noticed changes in Charlotte's behavior over the past month. The normally vibrant child had become withdrawn during lessons, often staring out windows with a troubled expression that seemed far too mature for her age. When questioned gently about her mood, Charlotte would simply smile and redirect the conversation, demonstrating the diplomatic skills she had inherited from generations of royals. The weight of what she had overheard was particularly heavy because it involved family members she cared about. Camilla had always been kind to Charlotte, treating her with the warmth of a grandmother despite the complicated history of her relationship with the royal family. The idea that Camilla's son might be involved in something that could hurt the family created a conflict in Charlotte's young mind that she struggled to process. Captain Morrison had received briefings about increased security protocols, though the specific reasons remained classified even at his level. He knew only that certain investigations were ongoing and that all family members required heightened protection. What he didn't know was that Charlotte had become an inadvertent witness to information that could prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the situation. The garden where Charlotte walked held special significance for the royal family. It was where her great-grandmother Elizabeth II had often taken morning strolls, where her grandfather King Charles had played as a child, and where countless generations of royals had found solace during difficult times. Today, however, the peaceful surroundings seemed unable to provide Charlotte with the comfort she desperately needed. As she paused beside a fountain featuring dolphins carved from Italian marble, Charlotte felt another wave of dizziness wash over her. The stress of carrying adult secrets, combined with the irregular sleeping patterns that had plagued her for weeks, was beginning to manifest in physical symptoms. She had been eating less at meals, despite her nanny's gentle encouragement, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of nights spent lying awake, trying to make sense of the fragments of conversation she had overheard. Captain Morrison's radio crackled softly with routine security updates, but his primary focus remained on the young princess. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this morning felt different from their usual peaceful garden walks. Charlotte's movements were becoming increasingly unsteady, and he began to close the distance between them while maintaining his professional demeanor. The investigation that had the palace in turmoil centered around financial irregularities in several charitable organizations associated with the royal family. Tom Parker Bowles had served on the board of one such charity, and questions had been raised about his role in certain transactions. While no formal accusations had been made, the mere suggestion of impropriety was enough to send shockwaves through the carefully maintained image of royal propriety. Charlotte had heard her father discussing the potential implications with her mother, speaking about how any scandal involving Camilla's children could destabilize the already delicate balance of public opinion regarding the monarchy. The complex web of relationships, loyalties, and public perceptions was far too sophisticated for a 9-year-old to fully comprehend, but Charlotte understood enough to know that people she cared about might be in trouble. The pressure of maintaining her composure while carrying this knowledge had been enormous. During public appearances and family gatherings, Charlotte had forced herself to smile and behave normally, but the effort was exhausting. She had always been a sensitive child, attuned to the emotions of the adults around her, and the current atmosphere of tension and uncertainty was taking its toll in ways that even she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Hartwell had suggested to the Prince and Princess of Wales that Charlotte might benefit from speaking with the palace counselor, someone trained to help royal children navigate the unique pressures of their position. However, the suggestion had been tabled pending the resolution of the current investigation, as the family was reluctant to involve additional personnel during such a sensitive time. The fountain where Charlotte now stood had been a gift from the Italian government following her great-grandmother's state visit in the 1960s. The dolphins represented peace and wisdom, qualities that seemed particularly elusive in the current circumstances. As Charlotte traced the carved stone with her finger, she felt her legs growing weaker, and a strange ringing began in her ears. Captain Morrison had seen enough. Professional protocol dictated that he maintain his distance unless there was a clear threat to the princess's safety, but his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He began walking purposefully toward Charlotte, speaking into his radio to alert the medical team to be on standby, though he hoped his precautions would prove unnecessary. The weight of royal responsibility had been gradually introduced to Charlotte as she grew older, but recent events had accelerated that process in ways that her parents hadn't anticipated. She understood that her family was different, that their actions were scrutinized by the entire world, and that even children were not immune from the pressures of public life. The knowledge that Tom Parker Bowles might be involved in something that could damage the family's reputation had become a burden she carried alone, too young to understand that adults should handle such concerns. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting the garden in brilliant light, Charlotte felt increasingly disconnected from her surroundings. The beautiful flowers, the carefully maintained pathways, and the peaceful sounds of birds seemed to fade into the background as a strange weakness spread through her body. She gripped the fountain's edge more tightly, trying to steady herself, but the stone felt cold and distant beneath her fingers. The palace staff had been operating under increased stress as well, though they maintained their professional demeanor at all times. Servants who had worked for the royal family for decades spoke quietly among themselves about the current situation, expressing concern for how it might affect the children. Charlotte, being the most observant of the young royals, had inevitably absorbed more of the adult tension than anyone realized. Captain Morrison was now close enough to see the paleness in Charlotte's complexion and the way she was swaying slightly on her feet. His years of training kicked in as he prepared to respond to what was clearly developing into a medical emergency, while simultaneously alerting the appropriate personnel through his secure communication system. The last thing Charlotte remembered before the world began to spin uncontrollably was the sound of her own voice, barely a whisper, calling out the name that had haunted her thoughts for weeks, Tom. The single word carried the weight of all her confusion, fear, and desperate need for someone to help her make sense of the adult world that seemed to be crumbling around her. As consciousness began to slip away, Charlotte felt herself falling, the beautiful garden tilting and blurring until everything dissolved into darkness, leaving Captain Morrison racing toward her with the training and dedication of someone who had sworn to protect the royal family with his life. Captain Morrison's boots echoed against the marble steps as he carried Princess Charlotte's unconscious form through the palace corridors, her small body alarmingly light in his arms. The scarlet stain spreading across her pale blue dress sent waves of panic through the usually composed security team, and the urgent calls crackling through radio communications brought the entire palace to a state of high alert within minutes. Dr. Sarah Chen, the royal family's personal physician, had been enjoying her morning tea when the emergency call came through. A woman of remarkable composure who had served the royal household for over a decade, she felt her heart rate spike as she heard the words Princess Charlotte and medical emergency in the same sentence. Racing through the corridors of St. James's Palace, her medical bag in hand, she mentally prepared for whatever awaited her in the royal apartments. The Prince and Princess of Wales had been in separate meetings when their private secretaries burst through the doors with news that would forever change their understanding of the pressure their daughter had been under. Prince William abandoned his discussion with Commonwealth representatives mid-sentence, while Catherine dropped her engagement portfolio and ran barefoot through the palace hallways, her maternal instincts overriding every protocol she had ever learned. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell stood frozen in the doorway of the makeshift medical room that had been hastily prepared in Charlotte's private quarters. The governess who had watched over Charlotte since her early childhood felt a crushing weight of responsibility as she realized how many signs she might have missed. The quiet withdrawal, the sleepless nights, the way Charlotte had been picking at her meals all made terrible sense now as symptoms of a child carrying far too heavy a burden. Dr. Chen's initial examination revealed that Charlotte's collapse had been triggered by severe dehydration, exhaustion, and what appeared to be acute stress response. As she worked to stabilize the young princess, checking vital signs and establishing in foreline, she couldn't help but wonder what could have caused such extreme physical symptoms in a child who had always been the picture of health and vitality. The blood that had initially caused such alarm turned out to be from a severe nosebleed brought on by stress and dehydration, but its dramatic appearance had created a scene that would haunt Captain Morrison for months to come. He stood guard outside Charlotte's room, replaying those terrifying moments when he had watched her small frame crumple to the ground, her voice barely audible as she whispered that single, troubling name. In the secure communications room deep within the palace, intelligence officers were frantically trying to piece together any potential security threats that might have contributed to Charlotte's condition. The mention of Tom Parker Bowles in her delirium had triggered immediate concern about possible connections to the ongoing investigation, though no one yet understood the full scope of what Charlotte had overheard or how it had affected her. Tom Parker Bowles himself was unaware that his name had become the center of a royal medical emergency. Miles away in his London home, he was preparing for a food festival interview, completely oblivious to the fact that a 9-year-old princess had collapsed while speaking his name, or that his connection to the current palace investigation had become a source of tremendous stress for a child who barely knew him. As Charlotte's parents maintained their vigil by her bedside, the weight of their royal responsibilities clashed painfully with their parental instincts. They had spent years trying to balance giving their children as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for their future roles, but recent events had shown them how impossible it was to completely shield royal children from the adult world of politics, investigations, and family complications. Catherine held Charlotte's small hand, studying her daughter's pale face and wondering what thoughts had been troubling her enough to cause such a dramatic physical response. The princess had always been perceptive, often demonstrating an intuitive understanding of adult emotions that both impressed and concerned her parents. Now that same sensitivity appeared to have become a liability, allowing her to absorb stress and anxiety that she was far too young to process. Dr. Chen had seen stress-related collapses before, but never in a child so young, and the severity of Charlotte's symptoms suggested she had been struggling with whatever was troubling her for quite some time. Blood tests revealed elevated cortisol levels consistent with chronic stress, and her dehydrated state indicated that she had been unable to maintain normal eating and drinking patterns for days or possibly weeks. The secure phone lines between Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace hummed with urgent conversations as senior royal staff tried to understand how a routine morning walk in the garden had escalated into a medical emergency that could potentially become a public relations nightmare. The presence of blood, however, minor at source, combined with Charlotte's mention of Tom Parker Bowles, created a complex situation requiring careful management. In her unconscious state, Charlotte's mind drifted through fragments of conversations she had overheard, trying to make sense of the adult concerns that had become her own. She dreamed of family dinners where laughter had been replaced by worried whispers, of her beloved step-grandmother Camilla looking sad and tired, and of her parents speaking in hushed tones about investigations and potential scandals that could affect the monarchy. The palace's public relations team had been placed on standby, preparing for the possibility that news of Charlotte's collapse might leak to the press. The royal family's relationship with the media had always been complicated, but involving a child's medical emergency raised the stakes considerably. Strategies were being developed to manage any potential coverage while protecting Charlotte's privacy and maintaining the dignity of the monarchy. Queen Camilla, having been informed of the situation, sat in her private study with tears streaming down her face. The possibility that her son's connection to the current investigation might have contributed to Charlotte's distress filled her with a guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. She had always tried to be a loving grandmother figure to William and Catherine's children, and the idea that her family's complications might have hurt Charlotte was almost unbearable. The investigation that had started all of this centered around financial irregularities in several charities associated with the royal family. Tom Parker Bowles had served on the board of one organization where questions had been raised about fund allocation and potential conflicts of interest. While the investigation was still in its early stages and no wrongdoing had been established, the mere suggestion of impropriety had created a crisis atmosphere within the palace. Charlotte's private secretary, though the position was largely ceremonial given her age, had noticed changes in the princess's correspondence and scheduling over the past month. Invitations to children's parties had been declined, and Charlotte had shown less enthusiasm for her usual charitable visits to local schools and hospitals. What had been attributed to natural childhood moods now appeared to be symptoms of deeper distress. The medical team monitoring Charlotte's condition noted that her heart rate remained elevated even in unconsciousness, and her sleep was restless with occasional murmurs that included fragments of conversations about investigations and family loyalty. Dr. Chen made the decision to consult with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and stress response, recognizing that Charlotte's recovery would require more than just medical treatment. Prince William found himself pacing the corridors outside Charlotte's room, his training as a search and rescue pilot having given him experience with emergency situations, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of watching his daughter suffer from stress that adults had inadvertently placed upon her. His protective instincts warred with his understanding that completely sheltering his children from royal realities was neither possible nor practical. The whispered conversations that had troubled Charlotte so deeply had been attempts by her parents to handle a delicate situation while minimizing its impact on their family. They had tried to discuss the investigation and its potential implications only when they thought the children were safely out of earshot, not realizing that Charlotte's natural curiosity and intelligence made her far more aware of palace undercurrents than they had assumed. Dr. Chen's examination revealed that Charlotte had been experiencing what adults would recognize as anxiety symptoms for quite some time. Difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and increased emotional sensitivity were all signs that she had been struggling to cope with information and concerns that were far beyond her ability to process or resolve. The physical collapse had been her young body's way of expressing the psychological burden she had been carrying. As news of Charlotte's condition spread through the carefully controlled channels of royal communication, family members across the Commonwealth began reaching out with concern and offers of support. The network of relationships and responsibilities that defined royal life meant that Charlotte's well-being was a matter of international interest, though the family was determined to handle the situation with privacy and dignity. The investigation itself had begun innocuously enough, with routine audits of charitable organizations revealing some financial irregularities that warranted closer examination. Tom Parker Bowles's involvement was peripheral at best, but the current climate of scrutiny around the royal family meant that even minor connections were being examined with intense focus. What no one had anticipated was that a 9-year-old princess would overhear enough fragments of information to construct her own version of events, complete with the anxiety and guilt that came from feeling powerless to protect people she cared about. The soft afternoon light filtering through the heavy curtains of Charlotte's bedroom created dancing shadows on the walls as she slowly began to regain consciousness, her small hand still connected to the 4-line that Dr. Chen had carefully maintained throughout the morning. Her parents sat on either side of the bed, their faces etched with concern and exhaustion from hours of watching over their daughter, while the palace's atmosphere remained thick with tension and unanswered questions. Charlotte's first conscious moment was filled with confusion as she struggled to remember how she had come to be lying in bed with medical equipment around her. The events in the garden felt distant and dreamlike, but the emotional weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks remained as heavy as ever. When she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, causing her mother to lean closer with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The child psychologist who had been consulted, Dr. Margaret Whitfield, sat quietly in a corner of the room, observing the family dynamics and preparing to help Charlotte process whatever had been troubling her so deeply. With over 20 years of experience working with children who had experienced trauma, she recognized the signs of a young mind that had been trying to cope with adult problems without the necessary emotional tools or support systems. As Charlotte became more alert, fragments of the conversation she had overheard began to surface in her memory, bringing with them the same anxiety and confusion that had overwhelmed her in the garden. She remembered hearing her parents discussing investigations and potential scandals, and, most clearly of all, she remembered the way Tom Parker Bowles' name had been spoken with such concern and worry that it had filled her young heart with dread. Prince William took his daughter's small hand in his, speaking to her in the gentle tone he reserved for bedtime stories and quiet moments together. He began to carefully explain that sometimes adults discuss complicated things that children overhear, and that it was never her responsibility to worry about such matters, though he could see in her intelligent eyes that she had already internalized far more than any child should have to bear. The investigation that had created such turmoil within the palace had taken an unexpected turn during the hours Charlotte lay unconscious. New evidence had emerged that actually cleared Tom Parker Bowles of any wrongdoing, revealing that the financial irregularities were the result of administrative errors rather than any intentional misconduct. However, this information had not yet been communicated to the family, as investigators were still verifying their findings. Catherine gently brushed Charlotte's hair away from her forehead, remembering her own childhood and how confusing the adult world had seemed when she was 9 years old. The difference, of course, was that Charlotte's family operated under a level of scrutiny and pressure that most people would never experience, and even childhood mishaps or misunderstandings could have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy itself. Dr. Chen monitored Charlotte's vital signs as she became more alert, noting improvements in her heart rate and blood pressure, though the child's stress levels remained elevated whenever certain topics were mentioned. The medical team had determined that Charlotte would need several days of rest and careful monitoring to ensure that the dehydration and exhaustion didn't have any lasting effects on her developing system. The palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, their usual efficiency tinged with concern for the young princess who had always brought such joy and energy to their daily routines. Charlotte had a special relationship with many of the longtime employees, often stopping to chat with gardeners, asking about their families, and remembering details about their lives that demonstrated her genuine care for the people around her. Mrs. Hartwell sat in her private office, reviewing her notes from recent weeks and recognizing patterns she wished she had identified earlier. Charlotte's increasing withdrawal from activities she normally enjoyed, her lack of enthusiasm for lessons, and her tendency to ask probing questions about adult conversations all made sense now as signs of a child struggling to understand and cope with information that was too complex for her age. As Charlotte became stronger, Dr. Whitfield began a gentle conversation with her about the burden of worrying about adult problems. Using techniques developed specifically for children in high-pressure situations, she helped Charlotte understand that overhearing adult conversations didn't make her responsible for solving adult problems, and that carrying such concerns alone was neither necessary nor healthy. The secure communications between various royal residences carried updates about Charlotte's condition to family members around the world, each of whom responded with concern and offers of support. King Charles, despite his own busy schedule of royal duties, cleared his calendar to visit his granddaughter, bringing with him a special book they had been reading together and a determination to ensure she understood how loved and protected she was. Tom Parker Bowles, having been informed of the situation by his mother, experienced his own crisis of conscience as he realized that his peripheral involvement in the charity investigation had somehow contributed to a child's distress. Despite barely knowing Charlotte personally, he felt compelled to help in whatever way possible, though protocol and the ongoing investigation limited his ability to take direct action. The garden where Charlotte had collapsed remained cordoned off while security teams reviewed the incident and implemented additional safety measures. Captain Morrison found himself unable to stop thinking about those terrifying moments when he had watched her fall, and the way her voice had carried such pain when she whispered Tom's name. His report would become part of the official record, but the emotional impact of the experience would stay with him far longer. Charlotte slowly began to share some of her worries with her parents and Dr. Whitfield, revealing the complex web of concerns she had constructed from overheard fragments of conversation. She had been worried about her step-grandmother Camilla being sad, about her parents being stressed, and about whether Tom Parker Bowles was in trouble because of something connected to their family. Her young mind had taken these pieces of information and created a narrative of responsibility and guilt that no child should have to carry. The investigation team, working around the clock to clear up the financial irregularities, finally confirmed that the issues were administrative rather than criminal in nature. Tom Parker Bowles had actually been trying to help identify and correct the problems when questions arose about his involvement, making him a solution to the investigation rather than a cause for concern. This information would soon bring relief to the entire family, though Charlotte would still need time to process and understand the resolution. Dr. Chen consulted with specialist colleagues about the best approach for Charlotte's continued care, recognizing that her collapse had been a wake-up call about the unique pressures faced by royal children. The medical team recommended ongoing monitoring of her stress levels and the development of better coping strategies for dealing with the inevitable pressures of royal life that she would face as she grew older. Catherine made the difficult decision to temporarily step back from some of her royal engagements to spend more time with Charlotte during her recovery, recognizing that her daughter's emotional needs had to take priority over public duties. The decision sparked discussions within the palace about how to better balance family responsibilities with royal obligations, especially when children were involved. The media relations team worked carefully to manage any potential coverage of Charlotte's incident without revealing specific details about her medical condition or the family circumstances that had contributed to her stress. The balance between transparency and privacy was particularly delicate when it involved a child's well-being and mental health. Prince William found himself reflecting on his own childhood experiences with royal pressure and media attention, remembering moments when he had felt overwhelmed by adult concerns that seemed to invade every aspect of life. His determination to protect his children while preparing them for their future roles had become more complicated as he realized how impossible it was to completely control what they were exposed to within the palace environment. As evening approached, Charlotte showed continued improvement in her physical condition, but the emotional healing would clearly take more time. Dr. Whitfield had scheduled regular sessions to help her develop better coping strategies and to ensure that she understood the difference between adult concerns that she might overhear and problems that actually belonged to her as a child. The resolution of the investigation, when it finally came, would bring relief to the entire family, but the experience had already changed how they approached discussions of sensitive topics around the children. New protocols would be developed to ensure that Charlotte and her siblings had better protection from adult stresses while still receiving age-appropriate information about their family's responsibilities and challenges. Queen Camilla's planned visit to Charlotte's bedside had been carefully coordinated to demonstrate that the family remained united despite the investigation and its aftermath. Her presence would help reassure Charlotte that the adults she cared about were safe and that the family relationships she valued remained strong and stable. The palace staff had already begun implementing changes to ensure better monitoring of the children's emotional well-being, recognizing that Charlotte's collapse had revealed gaps in their understanding of how royal pressures affected the youngest members of the family. These changes would have lasting impact on how the monarchy approached the welfare of its children in the years to come. 3 days after her collapse, Princess Charlotte sat propped up in her bed, surrounded by get-well cards from schoolchildren around the Commonwealth and flowers from the palace gardens that Captain Morrison had personally selected to brighten her room. Her color had returned to normal, and the foreline had been removed, but the emotional healing process was still ongoing as she worked with Dr. Whitfield to understand and process the events that had led to her hospitalization. The breakthrough in the investigation had finally been communicated to the family, bringing with it a wave of relief that seemed to lift the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the palace for weeks. Tom Parker Bowles had not only been cleared of any wrongdoing but had actually been instrumental in identifying and correcting the administrative errors that had caused the financial irregularities in the first place. What Charlotte had perceived as a scandal threatening her family had actually been an example of family members working together to maintain the integrity of royal charitable work. Prince William sat beside his daughter's bed, carefully explaining the resolution in terms that a 9-year-old could understand, emphasizing that Tom had been helping rather than causing problems, and that the adult conversations she had overheard had been about solving issues rather than covering them up. He watched as understanding dawned in Charlotte's intelligent eyes, followed by a mixture of relief and embarrassment that her worries had been based on misunderstood fragments of information. Queen Camilla's visit to Charlotte's bedside had been an emotional reunion, with the step-grandmother who Charlotte adored reassuring her that their relationship remained as strong as ever, and that adult problems were never the responsibility of children to solve or even worry about. Camilla shared stories about her own childhood anxieties and how she had learned that adults were capable of handling their own difficulties without needing children to carry their burdens. Dr. Whitfield had been working with Charlotte to develop what she called an emotional toolkit, strategies for managing anxiety, techniques for distinguishing between problems that belong to her and those that belong to adults, and, most importantly, ways to ask for help when she felt overwhelmed by information or emotions that were too big for her to handle alone. These sessions had become a source of strength for Charlotte as she learned that seeking support was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. The palace had implemented new protocols regarding sensitive discussions around the royal children, creating designated private spaces where adults could discuss complex matters without risk of being overheard, and establishing regular check-ins with the children to address any concerns or questions they might have about family matters. These changes would help ensure that future situations didn't escalate to the point where a child felt compelled to carry adult burdens alone. Captain Morrison had been deeply affected by his role in Charlotte's crisis, and he had requested additional training in recognizing signs of stress in the royal children under his protection. His quick response during Charlotte's collapse had potentially prevented more serious medical complications, and his detailed observations had helped the medical team understand the severity of her condition and provide appropriate treatment. Tom Parker Bowles had sent Charlotte a personal letter, written in simple language that acknowledged her concerns while explaining his actual role in the investigation. He included pictures from his food-writing adventures and invited her to visit one of his favorite child-friendly restaurants when she was feeling better, hoping to transform his name from a source of anxiety into a connection to positive experiences. The investigation's conclusion had broader implications for how the royal family approached charitable work and financial oversight. New systems were being implemented to prevent similar administrative errors in the future, and the entire experience had actually strengthened the monarchy's commitment to transparency and accountability in their charitable endeavors. What had initially seemed like a potential scandal had become an opportunity for improvement and growth. Charlotte's recovery had become a learning experience for the entire royal household, demonstrating the importance of considering how adult decisions and discussions affected the children who lived within the unique environment of royal life. Her emotional intelligence and sensitivity, which had initially made her more vulnerable to adult stresses, were now being recognized as valuable qualities that could be nurtured and protected rather than sources of concern. Dr. Chen's medical follow-up showed that Charlotte's physical recovery was complete, with her stress hormone levels returning to normal and her appetite and sleep patterns improving steadily. The collaborative approach between medical care and psychological support had proven effective in addressing both the immediate crisis and the underlying factors that had contributed to it. Mrs. Hartwell had adjusted Charlotte's educational schedule to include regular discussions about emotional intelligence, stress management, and the unique aspects of royal life that the princess would need to understand as she grew older. These lessons were designed to prepare Charlotte for her future responsibilities while ensuring she maintained a healthy perspective on the difference between adult concerns and childhood responsibilities. The media had remained respectfully distant throughout Charlotte's recovery, with only carefully managed statements about her improved health being released to satisfy public interest while protecting her privacy. The royal family's handling of the situation had been praised for its balance between transparency and appropriate protection of a child's well-being. Prince George and Prince Louis had been kept informed about their sister's condition in age-appropriate ways, and family activities had been adjusted to ensure all three children felt supported and secure. The experience had brought the siblings closer together as they learned about the importance of looking out for one another and sharing concerns rather than carrying them alone. Catherine had made permanent adjustments to her royal schedule, ensuring that she had more flexibility to respond to her children's emotional needs while still fulfilling her duties as Princess of Wales. The balance between public service and family responsibilities had been recalibrated based on the lessons learned from Charlotte's crisis. The garden where Charlotte had collapsed had been transformed with the addition of new benches and shade structures, making it an even more peaceful and supportive environment for the royal children's outdoor activities. Captain Morrison often walked through the space during his patrols, remembering the frightening morning that had led to such positive changes in how the palace approached child welfare. Charlotte's relationship with her step-grandmother Camilla had actually grown stronger through the crisis, as they spent time together discussing feelings, family relationships, and the importance of communication. These conversations had helped Charlotte understand that family love could withstand difficulties and that asking questions was always better than making assumptions based on incomplete information. The charitable organization at the center of the investigation had implemented new financial oversight procedures and had actually seen increased support from donors who appreciated the royal family's commitment to transparency and accountability. Tom Parker Bowles had been invited to continue his board service, with his role in identifying and resolving the issues being publicly acknowledged and appreciated. As Charlotte prepared to return to her normal activities, she carried with her new understanding about the complexities of adult life and better tools for managing her own emotional responses to challenging situations. Her experience had taught her that problems that seemed overwhelming to a child often had solutions that adults could find when they worked together. The palace staff had noticed a positive change in the overall atmosphere following Charlotte's recovery and the resolution of the investigation. The crisis had brought out the best in everyone involved, demonstrating the strength of the support systems surrounding the royal family and their ability to adapt and improve in response to challenges. Dr. Whitfield's ongoing work with Charlotte would continue as a preventive measure, ensuring that she had regular opportunities to process her experiences and develop her emotional intelligence in a supportive environment. These sessions had become something Charlotte looked forward to, as they provided her with tools and insights that made her feel more confident about handling future challenges. The entire experience had reinforced the royal family's commitment to prioritizing the well-being of their children while preparing them for their future responsibilities. Charlotte's recovery had become a symbol of resilience and the importance of addressing mental health concerns with the same seriousness and expertise applied to physical health issues. As Charlotte finally returned to the garden where her crisis had begun, she walked with confidence and joy, knowing that she was surrounded by people who loved and protected her, and armed with new understanding about how to handle the unique challenges of her royal life. The fountain where she had collapsed had become a symbol of renewal and growth, representing her journey from overwhelming anxiety to healthy coping strategies and family support. The lessons learned from Charlotte's experience would influence royal parenting practices for generations to come, ensuring that future royal children would have better support systems and more appropriate boundaries between adult concerns and childhood experiences. Her courage in facing her fears and accepting help had created positive changes that would benefit her siblings and future generations of royal children, making her crisis a catalyst for meaningful progress in how the monarchy approached the welfare of its youngest members.